Hi everyone, my name is Rajesh and in this video we are going to have a look at 5 steps of an ideal ERP consulting functional training. So far in our academic lives, what we are used to in terms of approach is first of all we need to learn the lessons in which there are certain concepts and there are certain information or knowledge that we learn, and then we appear for the exams which is loosely based on those concepts that we have learned or the application of those concepts to some extent. That has always been the approach when it comes to the studies and exams. However, in a training like ERP consulting domain, this approach needs to be changed or tweaked a little bit. And that is where these 5 extensive steps come into picture. The first step of an ERP consulting training is the business process understanding, wherein once you have learned about various business processes, it makes you a domain expert. So, when it comes to the functional training of an ERP, it is something which mainly revolves around 3 domains. One is financials, second is supply chain management, and the third is human capital management. These are 3 main domains. So there are various other domains also, such as customer experience, manufacturing, and so on and so forth. However, these 3 are considered as main domains: the financial, supply chain management, and human capital management. So in all these 3 domains, getting the basic understanding of the business processes is something that makes you a domain expert. So for example, in case of financials, you need to know what is journal entry or what is purchasing to pay process or procurement to pay process, which is also called P2P process. What is order to cash process? What is vendor invoice? What is vendor payment? How exactly the customer invoicing process happens, how exactly the receipts happen, or how exactly you can get the money from the customers. All of these business processes need to be known when it comes to financials as a domain. Similarly, for the supply chain management, you need to be knowing how exactly the warehouse management happens, or how exactly the inventory is mapped or tracked or managed, how exactly the reorder levels are maintained, how exactly the transportation management, route optimization, and so on and so forth happens. So all of these knowledge is ideal domain knowledge for a supply chain management domain. On the other hand, for the human capital management domain, it is all about like how exactly the employee recruitment process happens, how exactly the goal setting and appraisal process happens, how exactly the hire and fire cycle works, or let's say how exactly the payroll processing happens. All of these are the basic points or the basic business process understanding that will make you a domain expert in that respective domain. So that's always a first step when it comes to learning any ERP in order to, or let's say with the aim of becoming functional consultant. Second step is the level 1 hands-on testing on the system. Now, ERP training is never about just listening to certain lectures that are getting delivered, let's say either in person or through some videos, and then answering some questions. It's never just about that. It is always about doing those things on the system. For example, if you know what the journal entry is, or if you know how exactly the vendor invoice processing happens in the business, now when you are learning a specific ERP, you will also need to know how these things are done on the system. So how a journal entry is created on system, or how the vendor invoice is booked on system, or let's say how exactly the employee record is created in system, or how exactly a purchase order is punched in into the system. So all of these things you need to know. And it is not just about knowing by learning or knowing by watching some video. It is also equally about the hands-on testing. What do you mean by hands-on testing? It is something like you need to go to the system, you need to log into the system, and you need to actually try out doing that process into the system. And you need to reach to such a level where you are no more required to be taught, or you don't require to memorize or let's say remember how exactly a particular process needs to be done. It should come natural to you that if somebody tells you that okay, go in this particular system and create one purchase order, then you should be able to do it without any assistance of something like a user manual. Now this is step 2 in overall ERP consulting training, and this just makes you an end user of the ERP. What do you mean by end user? End user is someone who is going to be running this particular ERP in a business. So let's say if you are working as a purchasing executive in a particular business, then your day-to-day job will involve punching in the purchase order on a specific ERP system that is being used by that business. So knowing how to do all of these processes into the system just makes you the end user. It still does not make you the consultant. However, this is an essential second step in the overall journey of ERP consulting learning. Step 3 in the overall ERP consulting learning or training is deciding the business scenarios, thinking through all of these business scenarios, documenting those business scenarios as an analyst. So once you master this particular step, this makes you a typical business analyst. Now, what does that mean? Let's assume that creating a journal entry is one process in the financials domain. However, that is just a process. That process might have multiple different scenarios. Like what will happen if your journal entry is not balanced by debit and credit? Whether system will give some error or whether it will, let's say, automatically post that difference into a suspense account and so on and so forth. Similarly, in case of a supply chain domain, the example could be something like, let's say, purchase order or preparing a purchase order in the system is a step or is a business process. But within that business process, there could be multiple scenarios like, okay, whether system will allow you to create the purchase order with the same number, or let's say how exactly you create a purchase order with 5 different items with 5 different delivery dates, and those items need to be delivered at 5 different locations. How do you create such a purchase order? Now, creating a purchase order will not necessarily give you this expertise. This is a scenario versus the first thing that was just a process of creating the purchase order. So you may know how to create a purchase order in system, but you may not know how to create a purchase order with multiple items, multiple delivery dates, and multiple delivery locations. So knowing or understanding, or let's say imagining all of such scenarios, documenting all of these scenarios, and then thinking through how to do these scenarios into the system is something that is step 3 of the overall ERP consulting training journey. And this makes you a business analyst. Now, at this stage, you also need to be mindful about how exactly you want to document this particular business scenarios. And I always suggest that in terms of documentation, you will need to be extra particular in recording all of these scenarios that come to your mind or that you can think of, and tracking these scenarios, like what all scenarios out of these thought after scenarios you have tested in the system. What are those scenarios for which you have already got the conclusion, like how the system behaves in a particular scenario? What are the scenarios that are still pending to be tested, and so on and so forth? Because believe me, there could be hundreds of scenarios related to tens of different processes that you will have in your particular domain. And for no human, it will be possible to memorize or recollect or remember all of these scenarios. And that's where the particular documentation is something that is very much needed. Now, I'll be making a separate video on how exactly this ERP testing documentation log needs to be maintained. So let me not go into a detailed explanation of that right now, but documentation is something that you need to remember as an essential part of this training journey. Now, level 4 in your overall ERP training is testing of all of these scenarios onto the system. So at step 3 or level 3, we saw that, okay, you get the knowledge, or let's say you think through multiple different scenarios and then you document those scenarios into a specific documentation or the testing log. Now it is all about testing those scenarios onto the system. And at this stage, when you go on testing these scenarios into the system, there might be multiple setups and configurations into the system that you will need to be getting acquainted with. So that becomes very, very technical sometimes. For example, let's assume that you are learning how to write an email. Now, creating an account on Gmail, or let's say signing up or logging in and then drafting an email, or let's say writing an email and sending that email, that's more of a business process knowledge. But let's say that there is a feature wherein you can insert automated signature in your email. Now, to learn that, you will also need to learn some settings of your Gmail. right? So you need to go to some settings and then you need to understand how to create a signature, how to save that signature, and how to reuse that signature in your every email. So this particular thing is your level 2 or scenario testing, wherein you need a specific feature in a process to be used. So for that, you might need to go to setups, you might need to go to certain configurations in the system, you might need to tweak or change certain configurations, and then you will be enabling that feature or you will be able to use that particular feature. So that is all about level 2 testing that you need to do, which is also called a scenario testing. Once you do this scenario testing, you can call yourself a system expert. So by this time, you will be knowing not only how to do a high level process into the system for a particular domain, but you will also be aware of what all different features are there regarding that particular process into the system, and how exactly various setups or configurations affect those features or affect those individual parts of your overall business process. And you will have the conclusions recorded in a testing log in terms of how the system behaves for a particular test scenario. Now, in this stage, it is also important to prioritize the test scenarios, because believe me, you will get hundreds of test scenarios that you might think of that, okay, for creating a purchase order, there could be, let's say, n number of different possibilities or n number of different features that might be there or that might be needed by a business. However, all of those scenarios you may not be able to test in your initial training phase. So it will be very essential to document all of those scenarios, then decide the priorities in terms of what all scenarios are, let's say, the priority one scenarios, or what are those scenarios which will be indispensably needed by every business in a common parlance. So deciding those priorities and accordingly managing your time, which will be limited in terms of testing all of these scenarios, is another essential part at this stage. And the final and fifth step is about learning the consulting. Now, consulting is much more than what you have learned in last four steps. So in last four steps, first of all, you got the understanding about the business processes, then you tested those business processes into the system, then you thought of various business scenarios or functionalities, then you tested those functionalities into the system, maintained the detailed documentation of that. But till this time, you have just known what is business and you have just known what is system. Now it is a time in this fifth step to learn the actual consulting. So in actual consulting, first of all, you will need to be thinking through how to deliver this knowledge to the clients, what you have learned during this training. For example, you may be delivering the training on how to create a journal to some of the end users who are just, let's say, the accountants in a particular business. Now, while delivering that training, you need to be sure what to tell them and what not to tell them. Because if you give them some extra information in terms of how the system works and how various setups and configurations work for the features and functionalities that they may not even need, then in that case, they will start feeling that this particular system is very complicated and it will sort of backfire you. So that is where you need to be making conscious decisions in terms of what to teach to the users or what to showcase or demonstrate to the business users of the system, versus what not to demonstrate and what decisions you have to make as a consultant for them. So striking a fine balance between them is one of the thing. Another most important thing is about the soft skills. So you need to be learning how exactly to deliver effectively the knowledge that you have to the end users or to the business users so that they can learn the system effectively. How to, let's say, ask the questions at right time to gain the required understanding of their business processes, so as to then map those business processes into various configurations and setups of the system. Then, let's say, to demonstrate the system flows and functionalities effectively, to deliver the training effectively, to prepare the documents like user manuals and test scripts effectively. All of those things are typically considered as the consulting part, which is the final and fifth part in this overall 5 step process of the ERP consulting training. Once you master this part, then and only then you can call yourself as an ERP functional consultant. So I hope This video has given you sufficient insights in terms of how the ERP functional training is different from some academic sort of training and what all things you need to focus on in your initial ERP functional training journey. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Thank you everyone for watching this video. Recently, on our portal www.yourerpcoach.com, we have launched the login and first free course. So, if you are interested and if you want to build your career as a finance functional consultant in Oracle Cloud ERP, the course with which we are beginning our journey at yourerpcoach.com, then please visit our site yourerpcoach.com, log in, register yourself, and watch our first free course on basics of ERP. Once you complete this particular course and once you have completed your profile on our portal, we will be contacting you for the further process, shortlisting, personal interview, aptitude test, and so on, in order to admit you in our flagship course, which is Oracle Cloud Financials Complete Course. So if you want to build a rewarding career for yourself as an ERP consultant, go visit www.yourerpcoach.com right now.